So I think of these two passages, well, especially the passage from Luke, which is, many of you recognize, it sounds like the Sermon on the Mount. It's actually Luke's version, which is called the Sermon on the Plain, because in Luke's version, Jesus has come down from the mountain now, and he's on a level place, and he's teaching. In Matthew, Jesus goes up in a mountain, and everyone comes up, and it's a sermon from the mountain, but the same basic sorts of things are being taught here. And it's this interesting idea, I think, of what the kingdom of God, or the kingdom, as we like to say in here, the kingdom of God, what it's supposed to look like. And this is a very strange kind of way. If you saw this sign on the outside of a city, right? It says, "Welcome to our town." You know, a lot of cities have slogans on them. And this one says, "Welcome to our town, love your enemy." We love our enemies here, come on in. I mean, what's it actually saying? What's it actually asking? I think it would be a little bit scary. I thought I'd start off with some town slogans, right, that we read or that we see all over the place when we go to these towns. The most obvious one maybe you're familiar with. Austin's is what? Keep Austin weird. And Marfa's unofficial one is Keep Marfa mysterious. Fort Worth, you know what Fort Worth has an unofficial one they've been passing around trying to copy Austin's. You know what that one is? Where the West begins, but that's not interesting enough, you know. So now they did Fort Worth, keep Fort Worth funky. Right. And I'm going, really? I don't know. I've been here all of my life. I'm not sure. I like it, but I like Atlantic City, New Jersey. It says always turned on. Albuquerque has a new one. When I went out to Albuquerque, it used to be it's a trip. That used to be the one that they said, but now it says change your perspective. Yeah, I like that, actually. And if you land in Albuquerque and you start driving around and you see that there's Sandia Peaks to one side and everything else is flat and there's this whole desert sort of mentality going on there, that even though they got little green stuff that crops up here and there, it's still a brown, sort of 10,000 shades of brown. And it calls you into something. It calls you into a different kind of perspective. There was one of my favorites, because when I went through Kansas and I went to Gas, Kansas, they have a water tower that says, "Don't pass gas, stop and enjoy it." It's true, yeah. And Frankenstein, Missouri, when I was touring there some years back, I went to Frankenstein, Missouri, and made the mistake of saying the obvious. This town's a little scary, huh? And it was just like that. Could have heard a pin drop, like I hadn't heard that joke before. Peculiar, Missouri has one of the best. Peculiar, Missouri, where the odds are with you. What makes a town special, right? What makes a town, it gives it its character. The community, what makes the community gives it its character? What are its secret powers that transform you as you come in, or don't do anything as you come in? I think that's kind of what we're thinking about here as we look at this text from the Gospel of Luke. I mean, it's basically at the heart of what we what our country is rooted in, right? If you come through New York and you see the Statue of Liberty and you read the poem there, the New Colossus, that it's at the bottom, and we're familiar with the last lines of that. "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Right? I mean, what does that say? What is that really saying as a people? And then are we willing to live with this reality as a people? Right? That's kind of what the kingdom of God is about. That's what I think we're about here in 11:11. And I don't know if you really realize this or if you think about it, but when Sharma and I came up with this idea, we need to have an opening sort of ritual that sort of says what this is going to be about. And so we start with this wonderful poem from Rumi, right? This Middle Eastern mystic poet that says, "Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving. You know, ours is not a caravan of despair. Come, even if you've broken your vows 1,000 times, come yet again." What is that really saying when we say that? Every time I say that, I feel this sudden sigh of, all right, I'm okay here. This is a place to be. The place I left was rigid. The experience I had in church before was oppressive. I'm in the midst of questions. I don't know what's going on. I have screwed up so many times in my life. Come yet again. We break our vows all the time with life itself. Come yet again. To me, that's such a profound way of inviting people in, it begins to empower one another. I think that's what we do with the space within which we live. I talked last week about how we claim place as opposed to location, right? And how we do that in every encounter that we have because we live in the midst of this reality we call grace, something John Wesley was so prominent with and at the forefront of his teachings was this idea we are imbued with grace, we are born into grace, we live and move and have our being in grace. And what is grace? What is grace actually, other than this potential recognition that we are accepted at the very core of our being, that even the divine accepts us? We have this potentiality. I like to say that, the way Richard Rohr says that when we talk of Christ being in us and Christ being in you and Christ being in all things, or we call the cosmic Christ being in all things, or we say God is in the midst of everything, even as everything is in the midst of God, I like to think of this as if you're looking at the mirror and you're seeking that empowerment. You're seeking that acceptance. You're seeking that connection, and that connection, that divine acceptance, is looking back at you. Right? What we're seeking is looking back at us. That's a strange thing to get our head around. It's a strange thing to own. It's like saying we swim within the very ocean that is our being. No, I'm sorry. Take that back. We are, I got that in reverse. We are the very ocean within which we swim. I'm going to throw that at you again. We are the very ocean within which we swim. Thinking metaphorically. We live and move and have our being in the ground of God. God is the very ground of the being in which we live and move and have our being. We swim. We are the ocean within which we swim. That's a strange thing to get a hold of. It's a strange power to affirm because we live our life actually like we don't. We live by these narratives. And that's something of what's going on here with Joseph in this wonderful story that we're so familiar with. Joseph, the Technicolor Raincoat, we're so familiar sort of with the triviality of this story. And it's a profound story, but right here, this captures it. This captures it. He says, that's right, I'm the one you sold into slavery. Right? He doesn't start cussing. He's now in power. He doesn't bring the guards out and go, let's put him in a box for a while, see what it feels like. He says, come on up. Is Dad still alive? What's going on and how's it back home? You're welcome here. And then he says something that just blows everybody away. Now, it's very dualistic in this understanding. This is a 2,500-year-old story, right? He says, I'm here because God ordained it, essentially. I'm here because God put me here. This was a bigger plan. But I want you to think of it this way. I've shared this before. Our stories are always bigger than we think. Our stories are always bigger than the ones we keep telling ourselves. Always. Our stories are always bigger than the ones I tell about you or that I think you're telling about yourself. Always bigger. We're a part of this ocean of reality in which we live and move and have our being, and that story is the one that compels us to move forward with curiosity and compassion and to be more aware, to ask the question, what is this going on? That's really what this story is about. But what Joseph says is, come again. Even if you've broken your vows, even if you sold me into slavery, come again. And then we read this text where Jesus says, love your enemy. What a strange thing to say. If you want to know what God's kingdom looks like, it's this idea that stories are bigger than we think, that our stories are bigger than us, and the possibilities for us to participate in there are limitless. So, I'm looking down at my notes. I just skipped my notes entirely, so now I got to figure out where I am. There's this wonderful passage from 1 John 4. You might remember it, love is of God. God is love. If we say we love one another, then we're of God. If we say we don't love, then we're not of God, right? My favorite part of that passage is this one. It says, perfect love casts out all fear. Love your enemies is one of these things that we sometimes find ourselves messing around with and thinking about, nah, that's not possible. We do this sort of thing that I call foxhole theology, right? Where you go, like somebody will say to you, yeah, but there are no atheists in a foxhole, right? This distracted kind of thing that says, I've got a way to get us past the difficulty of that passage. Let's go to the foxhole, because that's reality. But in reality, there are atheists in foxholes. In reality, there are people that are so vile and so oppressive and so cruel and so disgusting and monstrous that the idea of loving them is crazy, right? But that's only because we think this verse is about trying to change them. And it's not. This verse is about changing us. It's that old adage that whether it's a Zen adage or whether it's the latest Zig Ziglar thing or positive thinking, the only person that we can change is ourselves. But when we do begin to change ourselves, things begin to change around us. We see the world differently. That's such the challenge that our church is in right now, I think. This idea of seeing the bigger picture is so difficult. But this is what we're called to do when we're called to love our enemy. We are called to see humanity in one another where most people wouldn't. We are called to see ourselves in one another where people really anger us or tick us off. We are called to see the ocean within which we swim. It's the same thing. We're all part of this same reality. And we can't experience it fully till we can embrace one another fully in this kind of love. Now, it doesn't mean, and I want to dodge this idea that I often hear when people will say to me, well, the way I look at that person because of who they are is love the sinner but hate the sin. See, again, that's that foxhole mentality. That's sort of like, okay, I'm going to distract the whole issue by going to the extreme because that's not what love asks of us. Love asks of us to get uncomfortable. Everything Jesus says in this passage, everything Joseph said or experienced in that moment that his brothers came back to him after all these years of having been sold into slavery, everything about this is if you're not uncomfortable in your encounters, you're probably not in the kingdom. You're probably not living fully out of that sacred divine love. You're probably living maybe a little more securely, a little more safely. And I get that. I get that completely. I get how hard it is to be with some people. I get how hard it is to think of the humanity of some people as I think of my own humanity. I get that. But the point of this text, and I think the point of Jesus' teachings, is that to find these powers that we have requires a couple of things. And the first one is that we are willing to get uncomfortable. Seth Godin, anybody in here know Seth Godin? I'm just curious how many people. Really? Seriously? He said this in an interview. He said, ask how many people know me. He's an international bestseller. He says, ask how many people know me. He says, nobody knows me. But he's been interviewed, hundreds and thousands of times. He's got a blog that's read by hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. And he's got all these best-selling books about marketing and new creative ways of doing marketing that have nothing to do with sales and have everything to do with changing the world you find yourself in. Isn't that interesting? So one of the things that he says in one of his marketing books, I heard this in this interview, he said if you're putting yourself out there and you're trying to be safe, then you're not being authentic. Authenticity often rarely has anything to do with safety. It has more to do with going where it's uncomfortable. It has more to do with challenging ourselves beyond where we find ourselves. What was it Carl Jung said? I think I put the quote in there. If we don't, something to the effect of, if we don't bring the unconscious to consciousness, then we are driven and we live according to the unconsciousness, and we end up calling it fate. Right? If we don't bring to surface those challenges we face, those realities that are part of our background, those narratives that we count somehow as unimportant, and yet we've never brought them to the surface. And so those same negative narratives are driving us. My father telling me when I was a young child that I didn't amount to anything. He was abusive. My father telling me when I was a young man in seminary, he deliberately named his hotel Paradise because he was so anti-Catholic, his Irish Catholic heritage. He so abandoned it and resented it that he named his own hotel Paradise. And anytime Linda and I would come over, he would say, "You keep preaching about paradise, and here it is right here on this little island in Belize. This is paradise." And it was lovely. But there's a lot of pain there. You could just hang around for any average day, and you'd see a lot of pain walking around. What does it mean to live authentically? Means to sometimes we have to bring that stuff up. We have to make conscious the narratives that are driving our lives so that we can see. Give it this language. God redeems these narratives when we surface them, when they bring them to the surface. They are calling for that opportunity, that invitation to find redemption, to find wholeness. Say it's life that asks us to do that, because if we're not living out of that authenticity, we are living out of this destructiveness that we call faith, that we are no longer taking control of, we are no longer empowered with. Seth Godin says this in his marketing thing, which is why I brought him up at the beginning. He says, this is how I approached all of my projects. I got an inner narrator. It's kind of a critic at times. It's often sort of self-adjusting everything I come up with. He said, when I hear that, I do exactly the opposite of what it's telling me. That's pretty risky. Our minds, our little inner narratives would love to go where it's safe. But when we hear that, Jesus is saying, that's the wrong direction. Love your enemies. Pray for those who hate you and persecute you. Hold them up in the light. Connect with them in completely different ways. Sarah Brecknick said it this way. She said, you have to be able to befriend your demons intimately enough. And this is the interesting thing. Some of you know exactly where I'm going with this. You've experienced it yourself. You have to be able to befriend your demons, those dark narratives, those self-destructive narratives, those challenges that we face that we're like, I can't go there, I disagree with that person entirely. You have to be willing to befriend them intimately enough to see suddenly beneath their wings, there's a blessing. There's a blessing hidden in that. In fact, it's likely the only way you're going to find that inner power is if you're willing to go there. So I want to finish with this last idea. We didn't have our PowerPoint today, but I wanted to read these lyrics to you because I don't know if you heard all the lyrics. I love this lyric. Superman, right? What's his main thing? What's the thing that he faces that he can't deal with? Kryptonite. What a great metaphor, Here's the reality. Most of us are carrying our kryptonite around with us, aren't we? Right? I mean, most of us are carrying our kryptonite. We just sort of go like, I can't see. Why do I keep falling into the same way of looking at things? Why does this keep happening to me? We're just carrying our kryptonite around. He says, I can't stand to fly. I'm not that naive. Isn't that interesting? Sometimes our powers call us out to places that are pretty uncomfortable. I'm just out to find the better part of me. I'm more than a bird. I'm more than a plane. I'm more than some pretty face beside a train. It's not easy to be me. Wish I could fall on my knees. Wish I could cry. Wish I could find a way to lie about the home I'll never see. And then what was at the end of Chief, which was just one of my favorite songs. There again, this is like Joseph's story, right? This guy up and down the street all day, up and down the street all day. Can't get to that dark place to face that obstacle, to free that blessing beneath the demon's wing. She says, Chief got out of the army. Jesus went, oh, no, she says, the narrator sings and she says this, I wish that people could see me when I'm flying in my dreams, right? I wish people could see me when I fly, the way I look when I fly, the way I live, the way I laugh. Then she said, Chief got out of the army. Jesus went to live with the poor. And I'm still marching up and down that street, and I don't know what I'm doing that for. Next week, we're going to spend a little time talking about courage. But today, the only thing I want to get across to you is just this idea. Sometimes, more often than not, the place where the gospel is calling us, the place where the kingdom of life is calling us, is to the uncomfortable place. If you hear the narrator in your head saying, and I realize this is a dangerous thing to say, I realize that. You hear that narrator saying, don't do that. That's uncomfortable. Do the opposite. I closed my blog with this. I want to close it with this today, if I can find it. In the face of where our church is this weekend dealing with LGBTQ rights, I was just talking with somebody over in the main building who has a very strong difference of opinion with me. And it would be easy for me to say that I stand for the rights of all people in the church to feel the full expression of God's love and interpersonal love with one another, and the right to live out that love in ordained ministry and service to others if they feel called to that service by God. That would be easy for me to say. That's even especially easy for me to say in here. The vast majority, I would say 99%. I'm going to even make a wild guess and say 100%, but I haven't talked to every one of you. But I have this sense that you were with me on that. That would be easy to say. And I think I could probably say that in front even of those who completely disagree with me, because I deeply believe that. And yet, that's not entirely true. Because I don't stand just for that. I stand for those others who disagree with me completely. Because I stand for love. The ground upon which I stand is grace, and I am not the owner, but its host. Wherever I find myself, and with whomever I find myself, enemy, friend, stranger, or family, ours is not a caravan of despair. Ours is a caravan of love.